You're watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Merry Christmas, everybody. Hope everyone has had a great Christmas so far. Christ is born. Glorify him. Before we get to the topic, I know several people have mentioned on social media that myself and my family have gone through a recent tragedy, and I just wanted to make a quick comment on that and then move forward. We went through a very tough time and still are going through a very rough time due to a recent tragedy in the family. And I'd appreciate the prayers for myself and the many others who are hurting right now. The only reason why I'm even trying to do a show this early on is I'm actually finding that it's helpful to do things that I would normally do. I'm finding that somewhat helpful and therapeutic. It gives me a sense of things being normal, and not that things will ever be normal again, but maybe a new normal and maybe something similar to it. But that's about really all I'm going to say about it. But please pray for me and the others in my family who are really hurting. So we'll leave it at that. I'd really appreciate it if y'all do, though. So remember me, especially when you go to Mass and my family. Now, let's move forward. Let's talk about the topic at hand. You know, I've had a chance to get on social media, very, very little of a chance lately, but I've got on a few times and I've seen some things that were definitely concerning, but did not want to address until the next time I did a show. So here we are. I'm seeing a whole lot of headlines that talk about the Pope and his war on tradition. The Pope attacks the faithful. I mean, stuff along those lines. I've seen a lot of it, and sadly, it's coming from the usual suspects, obviously, right? I mean, you expect that, but I've seen that same attitude coming from people that I didn't really expect for them to jump on the bandwagon. And I felt it was extremely irresponsible and damaging. What it is they're venting. They are upset right now. Maybe they're right to be upset. Maybe they're wrong. Doesn't matter, but they're simply venting. But it's people that I thought were better than that. And no, evidently they're not. And that's very disheartening to see that. It's very disheartening to see people talking about Pope Francis and his war on tradition and attacking the faithful, of course, with the recent dubia and further restrictions on the Tridentine ritual. And what I'm noticing here, well, I want to make several observations, several comments. But what I'm noticing here is a lot of assumptions that are being made. And the information that I was previously arguing about the magisterium and its authority to be able to revise liturgical rites, I really think went overlooked. Either it went overlooked or I wasn't convincing enough. One of the two. I don't know. But I haven't seen anybody sufficiently engage the magisterial text that I used to prove my point. So I can't say, well, it wasn't that I was convincing enough because I haven't seen anybody sufficiently offset what I've presented on the magisterium about the magisterium's right to revise liturgical texts. So I really maybe encourage y'all to, if you haven't already, go back and watch some of those videos, because what you're going to see is assumptions that are being made that shouldn't be made, assumptions that the rite is now a new rite. The Novus Ordo is a different rite from the traditional Latin Mass, quote unquote. I don't like that term. I think it's a misnomer, but we'll use it just because the vast majority of people use it. It's not a new rite. It is a revision. Of course, there are revisions. Some are good, some not so good. I think that we should have a reform of some of the reform. And I mean a reform going back in the backwards direction, but then not entirely. There were still some good reforms that came out of the post-conciliar era, but they are largely overshadowed by some not so helpful things, and then extremely overshadowed by actual abuses. So I want y'all to notice that. Usually the people that are complaining right now are assuming that the Pope has changed the rights and is forbidding a right. That I've even heard people say, well, for Eastern Catholics, if he were to say you can't celebrate the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, that's not what is being done. He has not forbidden an entire rite. He hasn't forbidden the entire Byzantine rite and just said, no, you can no longer do that, any more than he has forbidden the entire Roman Rite. No, he has not. What he's doing is he is restricting a particular use of the Roman Rite. But the Roman Rite is still intact in the Novus Ordo, as I have demonstrated and argued, and will continue to argue. It's overshadowed by a lot of abuses. So it often looks like there's a bigger divergence than there really is if the Novus Ordo was actually being celebrated properly. If it was being done properly, you would still see some differences. And there still need to be some revisions, in my opinion, and revisions backwards. But the divergence isn't as large as you would think if it's being done properly. So if the Novus Ordo was being done with a lot of Latin and Gregorian chant and ad orientem and communion on the tongue and had altar rails and wasn't iconoclastic, and I mean, just if all the things are done properly, this wouldn't even be a debate. This wouldn't even be, we wouldn't even have this discussion. The reason why we're having this discussion is because of the abuses. That's the only reason why people were even attracted to the traditional Latin Mass to begin with, is because they saw that as a safe haven. And, rightly so. Rightly so. It is a safe haven against the abuses. But don't think that means it's a safe haven against the Novus Ordo itself. It's just safe haven against abuses and bad priests. That being said, there are some problems even with the traditional Latin Mass, and there have been problems with some of its priests as well. So it's not a perfect safe haven, if you will. But yeah, sure, on the whole, I think you're going to find traditional Latin Masses celebrated more properly than you would a Novus Ordo. So I grant that. There's again a lot of assumptions being made in the arguments that I'm seeing. I saw a post. I don't know who it was, but evidently an Eastern Catholic priest was saying, if the Pope had wrecked my liturgy like he's wrecked yours, I'd be right there with you. And I'm just thinking that's actually not what has happened. But yeah, I understand that you're perceiving it that way, but you're not being objective. And what you're also doing is called dissent. You're being disobedient. That is called sin. And I see people couching it under the guise of, well, this isn't disobedience. This isn't a sin. This is just simply resisting evil or unlawful changes. You don't get to determine what is lawful and what is not as a layman. You don't get to determine that. As I've already showed from the magisterium itself, the magisterium determines what parts of the liturgy it deems fit to change and when it deems it fit to be changed. The magisterium determines that. It determines when it is appropriate, and it determines what is going to be revised, not you as an individual. You don't get to say this is uncanonical. You don't get to say this is illicit. You don't get to say this is unlawful. That's called disobedience. That's called sin. So it's very sad to even then see Eastern Catholics jumping on the bandwagon. I'm just thinking, oh, goodness, just stop it. It's not even close to equivalent to anything that has happened with the Eastern Catholics. And it's not analogous to the Pope restricting the entire liturgy of Chrysostom. No, the Roman Rite is still intact. So he has not restricted an entire rite, although he has that authority according to the magisterium itself. But he hasn't done that. So I've already demonstrated that, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but I do want to note that there are people doing that, and it's incredibly disappointing to see. Those who have not been anonymous in these comments, I've been very disheartened to see it, very disappointed. I have lost a lot of respect for people, a lot of respect for them. And I do look at them differently at this point. I do look at them as you're effectively in dissent. You're harming the church, whether you realize it or not. You're being disobedient, whether you realize it or not. You're not helping the church. You're harming it. And that's very disappointing, extremely disappointing. And I hope that changes. I mean, I changed in my view on this matter. I hope others will as well, because I used to take that same kind of approach, the very one that I'm criticizing right now. So I've been there. I've walked in those shoes. I've done those things. But my study of the magisterium and continued study of the issues liturgically has led me to a different conclusion. So again, very disappointed in this talk about war on tradition. What I think this has done is these recent events with the Pope when it comes to the liturgy, whether he's right or wrong. I'm not even weighing in on that on this show. Whether he's right or wrong, what this has done is it has brought to the exterior an interior dissent in Catholics that was already there. And I already knew it was there. And that's why I've been sounding the alarm even before these things happened. I was seeing this and I was sounding the alarm and calling people out and saying, this is what's going on. And this is a schismatic mentality, and it's going to lead to people leaving the church. And that's exactly what has happened. These events have brought an interior dissent that was already there to the forefront in the exterior. We're seeing that. The irony here is the Pope decided to make these restrictions because he felt that there were schismatic tendencies among some of the traditionalists. Whether he's right or wrong, that's where he was coming from. You know what, though? Many of the traditionalists have just proven him right. Now, not all. Clearly, there are exceptions. But from what I'm seeing, I get the impression they're just proving him right. They're saying things like this Pope, hates tradition. He hates the faithful. He's against the faithful. He's against the faith. He's against sacred tradition. I'm just thinking, do you hear yourself? Do you hear the way you sound right now? I mean, just think about it. There are Eastern Orthodox who are listening to you right now. And they're saying, yeah, we've been saying this all along. I had an Orthodox priest recently tell me, why are you Catholic? Why did you leave Orthodoxy? Why are you Catholic? What are you doing messing around with these Latins? Why? Don't you see what Catholics themselves are saying about the Pope? Don't you see that Catholics themselves are saying that the Pope is fighting against the tradition? Don't you see that Catholics themselves are saying that the Pope has wrecked the liturgy and is no longer allowing for the traditional celebration of the Roman Rite? And upon what basis can I really correct the Orthodox priests and say, well, technically those Catholics are incorrect, and It's gonna be my word against theirs, basically. Yeah, I could maybe walk him through the magisterial documents if he would, bear with me long enough and show him, okay, yeah, this is why they're wrong. But all that Orthodox priest is seeing is all this news about war on tradition. The Pope's wrecking and destroying the liturgy, and he hates the faithful. And the priest and many other Orthodox are just saying, that's what we've been saying all along. Why are you still Catholic? Why don't you come join us? We've been saying this all along. On what basis are you going to tell that Orthodox priest he's wrong? On what basis? Mr. Orthodox priest, be in full communion with this Pope who hates you and hates your tradition and who wants to destroy your soul. Please be in communion with him because it's necessary for your salvation. Are you kidding me? Are you serious? Do you really think anybody's going to buy that? Nobody is going to buy that. That's the worst sales pitch for the church I've ever heard in my life. That's the worst thing possible that you could say if you're trying to evangelize people. But the problem is a lot of the people who are saying these things about war on tradition and this Pope hates people and he hates the faithful and he hates the faith itself. And those are people who don't actually have to engage the Orthodox. They're people who live in traditional Catholic circles only. They're living in that bubble only. They don't have to then turn around the very next day and talk to an Orthodox. They don't have to do that. So they're not called to that consistency. For me, however, I have to do that. I talk to Orthodox and Protestants all the time. I have to have those discussions. And they're rightly going to say, but your own people are saying this guy is wrecking your liturgy, but you tell me that, somehow the papacy is an essential part of the constitution of the church. How is that possible? How does that work? So you're telling me this structure that's essential to the constitution of the church, that's there according to Vatican I to protect and preserve and guard the faith and be a sea of unity, is a sea of destruction and is destroying souls and hates tradition and is currently on a war against tradition. That it's incredible. If you were to just simply look at what the Catholic Church says historically, and especially what it says about the Pope's right over the liturgy, then compare it to what many Catholics today are saying, and then also compare that to what an Orthodox is going to say in response, it becomes pretty apparent that this is an untenable position and that people are going too far. Again, that doesn't mean that one has to agree that everything Pope Francis has done is prudentially right. Maybe not. Here's the thing, though. You don't get to decide that. Neither do I. You don't get to decide that. Ultimately, it is the church, according to Trent and Vatican I, and some popes in between, who get to decide what is fit to be modified when it comes to the liturgy. It's the Pope and the bishops assembled with him or an ecumenical council. It's the magisterium that gets to determine those things, not individuals. You might have an opinion that this or that is imprudent. And hey, maybe you're right. But you don't get to say this is illicit, this is illegal, we're just going to dissent, I don't have to obey this. That's when you go too far. That's when, the Orthodox are rightly going to say that doesn't make sense. They're going to try to call you to consistency. You're not going to be able to do it. And then they're going to say, why are you still Catholic? Why aren't you Orthodox now? And really, on what basis are you going to be able to respond to them? Are you really going to argue this sea that you believe is a sea of disunity and is a sea that is operated by under Satan? I've seen memes by actual traditional outlets talking about the Pope being under the power of Satan right now. You really believe the Pope is under the power of Satan But what Vatican I says about the papacy being a sea of unity is the case. And you also think that being in communion with this sea that's under Satan right now is essential to your salvation. Do you not hear how ridiculous you sound right now? Just stop it. Like I said on the thumbnail for this video, please stop it. You sound ridiculous. You sound like fools if you actually believe that. Please stop it. Again, you don't now have to go to the other extreme and say, well, everything that is being done by this papacy is somehow perfect and there's no problems and every decision is perfectly prudential. And that's the other extreme. That's not what's being said, but don't go to the other extreme and say that this is a sea that's controlled by Satan and there's a war on tradition and he hates the faithful. It's going too far. I also want to say this. Look, let's get on. Let's be honest with ourselves. The Novus Ordo is not going anywhere. There was an ecumenical council that called for liturgical revisions, and yes, some of the liturgical revisions that have happened in the post-conciliar era went beyond what the council called for. But still, even the liturgical changes that it called for are reforms to the Missal of John the 23rd. So reforms were called for by an ecumenical council. That's not going to be reversed anytime soon. No time soon. Stop fooling yourself if you just think, let me hold out a little longer and just a little bit longer. We'll have a pope who will just completely reverse everything from Vatican II. Are you serious? You really think that? You really believe that? You're in the wrong church if you really believe that. If that's what you're holding out for, you know what? You're in the wrong place. That's not going to happen. The Latin Mass is not going to take over the world and the Novus Ordo is just going to disappear. That's not what's going to happen. And an ecumenical council is not going to be called anytime soon to reverse any of those things. And no pope is going to come out, and there's not going to be a Pius the 13th who's going to come out anytime soon and is going to just overturn all these things. It's ridiculous. Not going to happen anytime soon. If there is going to be some kind of change, it's going to be slow and gradual, and it will be a reform of the reform. It's not going to be this, all of a sudden you have this Pius the 13th who just reverses everything like you have in that series, The Young Pope or something. That's not what's going to happen. The Novus Ordo is not going anywhere. What's much more likely, again, to be the case is that the Novus Ordo will be revised in a way that brings it closer to what we see with the traditional Latin Mass. That's much more likely, but that it would happen gradually. It's not going to happen overnight. But it will end up going in that way, right? The pendulum has swung the opposite direction, and it's gonna come back. Maybe not immediately, but over time, that's what's going to happen. I would imagine. So you're going to see a reform of the reform over time. I would say, yeah, within our lifetime, you'll see it. I don't think that it's going to be a complete reform of the reform within our lifetime, but I do think that within our lifetime, you're going to see things leveling out and getting a little bit more traditional and more stable and more ad orientem and more communion on the tongue and more faithfulness just to some of the ways things have been done in the second millennium in the Roman Rite. A little bit more traditional. And again, what we're considering traditional here is innovations. It is something that a lot of these things developed in the second millennium, but be that as it may, I don't advocate antiquarianism. I think some of these developments in the Roman Rite were actually helpful for the Roman Rite, such as communion on the tongue. I mean, going from communion on the hand to communion on the tongue in the Roman Rite, I actually think going to communion on the tongue was a good innovation. I think that was helpful and should be preserved and kept intact. Same for, Gregorian chant or Latin in the liturgy, although that was much earlier as far as a revision, especially just use of Latin in the liturgy, but Gregorian chant as well. Or even low masses or even private masses, right? Those are second millennium developments, but I still think that they're good and helpful. So, anyways, without going too far on a rabbit trail there, I do think there will be a gradual swinging back towards some of those more traditional aspects that you see in the Roman Rite prior to the post-conciliar liturgical reforms. That's much more likely to happen than some pope is just going to come and overturn and reverse everything. That's just simply not going to happen. Let's get real. What we need to focus on is reforming the reform. Now, what the Pope was trying to do here is, number one, address a schismatic tendency among some traditionalists. And yeah, as I've noted before, that's a good thing. But I would first address the schismatic liberals in the church and those dissenters first if I were a pope. But you know what? We don't always see things from the same perspectives, right? And maybe he should see it from that perspective. I think that's fair, but he doesn't see that. So he's calling certain traditionalists to faithfulness without being as consistent in calling liberals to faithfulness. Well, I do think we could question the prudence behind that. But does he still have a right to call some of these traditionalists to faithfulness and away from a schismatic mentality? Yeah, he still has the right. So that was his intention here, according to what he tells us. And I have seen people saying, well, he's lying. That's not his intentions. He's lying. This is all a lie. This is a cover up. That's just what they're saying. But really, here's what it's about. Do you not hear yourself? That is called sin. You don't know that. You don't have evidence of that. You don't know that that's a lie. So you have no basis to publicly say such things about someone over and against what they tell you their intentions are. That is called sin. You cannot do that unless you have evidence that that is the case. And from what I've seen so far, we don't have that evidence. So again, what he's trying to do is address certain schismatic mentalities among some traditionalists. Okay, all right. He's also trying to unify the Roman Rite, and I actually think that's a good thing. Now you might say, but this has the opposite effect. It's actually dividing the Roman Rite and Christians in the Latin Rite, and you might have a point there. Maybe right now, trying to press for these changes is doing that. You might have a point there. Perhaps it is. I think that's probably the case. I think right now this is leading to more division than it is to bringing people together, but not necessarily because of Pope Francis, but because of where some of these traditionalists are, because of them, not necessarily because of what Pope Francis is doing. I don't think what he's doing in and of itself is wrong, but where people are at, they're not ready for this clearly. If they have this interior dissent that's clearly coming out, yeah, maybe this isn't the best time to do it. You could argue that, but that is his intention. He's trying to unify the Roman Rite. And you know what? Frankly, that makes sense. We should have that. I just would simply question, is now the best time to do that? And is this the best way to go about doing it? You can ask those questions. But should we have just one particular Roman way in which we use the Roman Rite? Yes, absolutely. I don't think that the Roman Rite should be divided between pre and post conciliar. It's not helpful. Maybe that's okay as a temporary solution until we mature enough to the point that, and we're fixing the abuses in the Novus Ordo to where we can just say, okay, we're going to have just the Novus Ordo. But just speaking objectively and ideologically, it's not a good idea to have two separate ways in which you celebrate the Roman Rite. It really needs to be united and unified. And that's what he's trying to do. So again, if the Novus Ordo isn't going anywhere, the TLM isn't going to take over the world. it does make sense that in time there should be a gradual development or move towards the revised missal. At the same time, if you're going to move as a pope or as the magisterium as a whole, if you're going to move people to the Novus Ordo, and just say, look, we're going to have just one unified way of doing this, in and of itself, that's fine. But what you need to do is clean up the Novus Ordo first. I mean, nobody wants to be compelled to be part of the Novus Ordo when it's being abused all over the place. Address the abuses, make sure it's being celebrated properly, even revise some of the things that are, some of the objective aspects to the missal, making them a little bit more closer to the missal of John the 23rd. Add some of those prayers that were taken out. Add some of those scriptures that were taken out of the lectionary. Make some reversals and reforms to the breviary. Make some of those changes that bring it closer to the older usage. Maybe even require that only canon number 1, Roman canon number 1 is going to be used. The other ones are going to be dropped. I mean, that might even be helpful, and require ad orientem. Make that mandatory. Maybe that won't happen overnight, but I mean, gradually that could happen. Maybe start out with certain high feast days are going to be ad orientem, and then slowly, gradually phase that back in to where everything's ad orientem. And start to phase out communion on the hand, phase out women altar servers, phase some of these things out. Once you've cleaned up the Novus Ordo, then it would be much more presentable and bearable for people who are being transitioned from TLM masses to Novus Ordo masses. Then it won't be such of a shock and so offensive if what they're attending is an abuse of the Novus Ordo. So in my opinion, I think that needs to be addressed first, clean that up, and then unify the Roman Rite. The Pope has taken a different direction, and ultimately it's up to him to decide. Him, and of course the magisterium, being not just the Pope, but also the bishops, get to decide this as a whole. So an ecumenical council, or the Pope consulting the bishops as a whole. So the magisterium gets to determine ultimately what decisions it's going to make, when it's going to make them, to what extent. It ultimately has that decision. I don't. I can have my personal opinion, but ultimately it's the magisterium that determines those things, and I have to. I might be able to say, well, I think that we need to do this, we need to do that, but as long as I'm not dissenting, as long as I'm not saying, well, this guy is warring against the church and the SSPX was right all along, and as long as you're not saying ridiculous stuff like that, I mean, I think you can have an opinion and say, I'm not sure this was the most timely moment to make these changes, right? As Dona Veritatis allows a person to do carefully. But again, I think at this point, what we need to do is focus on reforming the Novus Ordo the best that we can, instead of this pipe dream that the TLM is going to take over the world, or that somehow I can be completely opposed to everything this Pope does and think that he has a war on tradition, and just think that he is the vehicle of Satan, and he hates the faithful, but I have to be in communion with him for my salvation. So I'm going to recognize but resist. There is a grain of truth to recognizing and resisting, a grain of truth to that, but not in the recognize and resist way that we see today. That's what's innovative, and that's what's inconsistent. That's not a legitimate avenue. And again, what recognize and resist people will do is they will take some cases where a pope's decisions have been resisted, and they use that to say, Therefore, what we're doing is proper, and it doesn't logically follow for numerous reasons. I've never seen where the magisterium makes disciplinary changes to the entire Roman Rite, and this has been resisted, and somehow that person was not a dissenter. If there are such cases, I'd like to know about them, but I haven't seen that. So to me, pointing to some cases where, like Catherine of Siena or something, where she's resisting certain abuses and things like that in the papacy, that's not equivalent to what's going on now, because it assumes that these changes that are being made are abuses and illicit and unlawful. And again, it's not you who gets to determine that these are illicit, unlawful, uncanonical. You don't get to determine that as a lay individual. The magisterium gets to ultimately determine those things. And as Vatican I and Trent says, the magisterium gets to make the changes that it sees fit to make to the liturgy. So I don't see how some of those cases of resisting the Pope actually helps the recognize and resist agenda. So again, I think what we need to do is focus on reforming the Novus Ordo. If you're in the Roman Rite, what you need to do is focus on reforming the Novus Ordo instead of this incredibly outrageous view that the Pope has a war against tradition and hates the faithful, and you can resist him on this, but still recognize that he's the Pope and essential to your salvation. I don't see it. Doesn't work out. That doesn't mean that the papacy can't make mistakes or imprudent decisions, but what is being charged against the papacy at this point by the recognize and resist crowd is much more than that. It's something that would actually undermine the indefectibility of the papacy. And as that Orthodox priest friend of mine rightly notes, well, if you guys are saying this, why are you Catholic? Why aren't you with us Orthodox? It's a fair question. If you really believe that there's a war on tradition by the Sea of Unity, yeah, you really need to start questioning, is this a Sea of Unity? And if it's not, then you just showed that Vatican I, at least in your mind at that point, isn't true. Therefore, why are you still Catholic? Now, I don't believe that anybody has actually demonstrated. I'm just saying it in the person's mind who thinks that the sea is now just has a war against tradition. If you really believe that, then you've just convinced yourself in your own mind that the church has defected from the faith, because the standards that Vatican I has laid out there about the See of Peter being the Sea of Unity, as the Relatio of Gasser notes, have just been falsified. Why are you still Catholic? Again, you might need to question whether or not there's an actual war on tradition from the See of Peter. You might need to question that premise. But if you've already bought into that, you should say, well, it does logically follow that, Vatican has been invalidated. I shouldn't be here anymore. Again, according to the Relatio. But once more, my position is what you actually need to do is question the premise. Is there in fact a war on tradition? You need to question that. Has the Pope actually changed the rite, destroyed and wrecked the rite? You need to go back and question those premises. Those are the ones that are problematic. Those are the ones that I question. And those are the ones that I would say you should not accept, because I believe those are false. But if you have accepted those things, yeah, why are you still here? And some people have accepted those things and left, and now they're agnostics, now they're atheists, or they're Eastern Orthodox, or they're Protestants. Okay. At least they're trying to be consistent. Maybe on that point, I don't know about others, but at least they're trying. Not sure I could say the same for the many people that I've seen on social media jumping on the bandwagon, blasting the Pope, and saying things that I didn't expect them to say. And frankly, I feel embarrassed by some of these Catholics. And I feel embarrassed to be a Catholic when I see a Catholic say that. At some moments, I feel just very, very embarrassed. Because I know there's other non-Catholics who are reading these guys, and that just makes me look like a fool at this point, because they're going to think, well, Michael, you're a Catholic. You actually believe this? No, I don't believe that. That's not what I believe. Those people don't speak for me. But that's what people think Catholicism is when they start seeing this stuff. And it makes us look like fools. So, yeah, it is embarrassing. Well, I hope this has been helpful. However, as a brief assessment of the situation going on right now when it comes to the Roman Rite and the liturgical developments that we're seeing here, whether you think they're prudent or imprudent, right or wrong, I hope at least that the comments that I'm making have been helpful. But much, much more can be said here. But this, I guess, is a good start. Not sure, however, when I'll touch on this topic again, though, because I've gotten to the point that unless I really feel this has to be addressed, which I felt today, this as at the point that it really needs to be addressed. Unless it really has to be addressed, I'm just tired of addressing Roman Rite issues and the chaos going on right now with some traditionalists, because it tends to be an incredibly toxic environment. I'm gravitating towards other topics for shows because I've noticed the commenters and the other people that I see on social media that are in this crowd tend to be some of the most toxic, soul destroying, and disheartening people. That it's just, I feel filthy even having to engage some of those people that I just wouldn't, you know what, unless I have to engage this topic. I just don't, I want to distance myself from those people. So let me talk about something else. Can we talk about scripture? Can we talk about the canon? Let me maybe go and do a video reviewing something by Protestant or something at this point. I want to get away from these toxic people, unless it's something that I really feel absolutely has to be addressed, such as today. Otherwise, I'm just, yeah. So again, I say that to say, no, I don't know when's the next time I'm really going to talk about this particular topic. You can get more. What you'll be seeing more from me is reviews of videos, having guests on the show, commentary on scripture, stuff like that. So, all right. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please help it grow. Hit that bell for notifications so you can know when we go live. And also check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology. If you want to support what we're doing here so that we can, continue to provide this content to you for free. All right. We'll see y'all later. Merry Christmas. Christ is born.